Well, thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. It's nice to be in a cool auditorium, isn't it? Even walking from the car, it's a little warm. This afternoon, we're going to talk about animal concealment, which I have called animal mind games for reasons that will become apparent a little later. Now, before I get into the topic, some of you, I know, saw an earlier version of this in January, and you will understand when I ask you not to spoil the surprises for those who have not seen this before, okay? Also, please raise your hand if you're not familiar with the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. Whoa, okay. Please raise your hand if you're not familiar with the McDowell Sonoran Conservancy. Okay, well in that case, I'm going to skip quickly through the next slides, which talk about the preserve that you all are familiar with, and the conservancy that, again, you've all are. By the way, in the last year, 73,000 hours. Which is amazing. Okay, so let's talk about animal concealment. I want to set the stage, though, with a really important observation that we all understand intuitively, but I'm going to give you some examples. Many animals sense the world differently from other species and from us. And that's not surprising because all animals have evolved through natural selection to be well adapted to whatever environmental niches is their native home. And every niche has its own challenges and opportunities, and the animals have evolved to respond to those in a way that allows them to survive and reproduce. And because different environments present different challenges and opportunities, it's not surprising that animals might sense their world differently than some other animal would sense its world, or that we would sense ours. But let me give you some examples. This one I think we all understand. Now, we actually, on the one hand, compared to other species, have a lousy sense of smell, and yet we can detect hundreds and sometimes thousands of different aromas. Think of the people who blend perfumes, for example. But you all know that your dogs can smell a lot better than you can, and which means a couple of things. Your dogs can detect odors that we can't detect at all, and they are more sensitive to odors that we could detect if they were strong enough. But the winner, at least among mammals, is generally acknowledged to be bears, which have a sense of smell that is hundreds of times more sensitive than ours. Hundreds of times. We can smell a dead deer carcass from 100 feet away. A bear can smell that carcass from 10,000 feet away and home in on it because it's food for the bear. So very different senses of smell throughout the animal kingdom. Hearing. We actually have pretty decent hearing. We can hear a pretty broad range, at least when we're young. We can hear from 20 hertz, which is bass, to 20,000 hertz, which is high treble. And as we age, guess what happens? Which is why so many of us, including me, wear hearing aids. There are some animals that can make and hear frequencies much lower than we can, that we can't perceive at all. Elephants can make and hear sounds as low as 5 hertz. We would feel that as a vibration. We couldn't hear it. The advantage of that very low frequency sound is that it's omnidirectional and it travels enormous distances. And it's thought that elephants use infrasound to keep track of other herds of elephants widely dispersed in the landscape. At the other end of the spectrum, I think you all understand that there are some animals that can hear and make frequencies much higher than we can hear. Ultrasound. The poster animals are bats and dolphins. These animals use those very high frequency sounds both to communicate with other members of the species and locate each other, but also to locate obstacles. They use those high frequencies as a form of sonar, and they can perceive the echoes and make sense of, create a picture of the world from those ultrasound echoes and locate moths flying, prey for bats, or shoals of fish, prey for dolphins. So there are considerable differences from animal to animal in how they hear. Concealment is primarily a visual phenomenon, so let me talk a little more length about visual differences. Many animals see different colors than we do. This is a human-centric picture of the spectrum. What we can see beyond red is infrared, which we perceive as heat, not as a color. And beyond purple at the other end is UV, which gives us sunburns and is not a color except when your skin turns red. But if I put us onto the spectrum, that's where we are. We are beaten by many birds, particularly raptors, which can see all the colors we can see. They have the same set of color receptors in their retinas that we do. They also can see into the ultraviolet, which we can't perceive. It's well known that some insects, notably pollinators, can't see red, but they can see ultraviolet. And when scientists have taken flowers that to us look monochromatic, like it's a solid yellow flower, solid white flower, shine UV light on it, guess what? Patterns appear on the petals of the flowers. We can't see them, but bees can. And presumably, those patterns mean something to the bees and are of some benefit to them, and presumably they are of some benefit to the flower as well, otherwise it would not expend the energy to produce these additional colors. I was very surprised to learn that many big predators, like the big cats, have terrible color vision, very limited ability to perceive color, but it may not be important because the typical prey, particularly of the big cats, are ungulates, deer, antelope, and the like. And guess what? They have almost the same limited color vision. So this is a case where predators and prey seem to have somehow matched each other in terms of what colors they see. Now, reptiles are really interesting. Most reptiles have terrible color vision, almost don't see things in color. The world is almost monochromatic to them, except for the class of snakes that are called pit vipers, which in addition to having eyes with retinas, also have two pits on their snout, and in those pits are receptor cells that are sensitive to infrared. Now, we can perceive infrared as heat, right? I mean, if we get close enough to a really hot object, we know it's there. And we can usually, if it's hot enough, judge distance. We can't judge small differences in heat at all. But pit vipers can judge distance, size, and even tiny differences very well because the receptor cells they have in the pits are really good at it. And they have two of them, so they have kind of binocular heat vision. And it's thought that although we perceive infrared as heat, It's thought that these pit viper snakes actually perceive infrared as a color that we don't see, because when scientists have traced the nerves coming out of the retinas of the eyes of the snake and the nerves coming out of the pits of these snakes, those two sets of nerves merge and enter the brain in the optical center. So it's thought indirectly, I mean, we can't ask, it's thought that the snakes are actually perceiving infrared as a color. Now there's another important aspect to visual capability, and that's acuity, visual acuity. How well can an animal species see details from a certain distance? We actually have quite good visual acuity. I mean, think about it. Maybe it requires glasses or contacts, but by God, we can read the bottom line in the doctor's office from across the room. No? Well, most of us can. Raptors have us beat hands down. Raptors have extraordinary visual acuity, which makes sense, right? You're flying 100 or 1,000 feet above the ground looking for prey the size of mice or lizards. You'd better have really good visual acuity to be able to pick out that level of detail from that distance. To us, everything would be a blur, 100, let alone 1,000 feet up. And most of the other animals that I've just talked about have very poor visual acuity, which means from any distance, the world is a blur. They have to get very close to whatever they're looking at to actually see with the kind of detail that we would see from much further away. So, I mean, the point here, and the thing that I want you to remember, is that different species of animals and humans see the world very differently from each other. And then also smell, taste, hear the world differently, but we'll focus on vision. So let's talk about animal concealment. There are two main reasons why animals would conceal themselves. What are they? What do you want to conceal yourself from? You got one at a time and say it louder because I wear hearing aids.
Predators.
Predators, good, that's number one. What's the other one? Food, prey. The two reasons why you would expect animals to conceal themselves are, first of all, conceal themselves from their prey, assuming they're eating something that can move, not leaves or something like that. But if you're after prey that can move, and especially if it can move as fast or faster than you can, it's really good to be concealed because you can get closer to the prey and may be able to surprise it. And that means that in some cases, a concealed animal will eat better than an unconcealed animal. And if you eat better, usually you're bigger, stronger, healthier, and in the animal kingdom, better able to attract a mate. The other thing that you said, and you're right, is conceal yourself from predators so that you avoid getting eaten prematurely. Most things in the animal kingdom, as you know, eventually do get eaten by something. But you'd like to delay that until after you've had a chance to reproduce as many times as possible if you're an animal. And there's an evolutionary pressure here that's encouraging concealment, because if you think about it, if you're well concealed and you eat better and therefore bigger, stronger, healthier, better able to attract a mate, and if you can delay getting eaten for a long time, you're liable to have a lot of mates, a lot of offspring, and from an evolutionary point of view, that's winning. So one would expect there to be a pretty strong evolutionary bias for many animals to have developed concealment strategies. When I talk about concealment, what word comes to your mind? What's the one word? Kind of concealment. Camouflage. And most common kind of concealment is camouflage. There actually are different varieties of camouflage. The kind that we're most familiar with is outline blending, like the background of the slide. And there the strategy is, instead of it being obvious that there's something out in front of the background, the point of outline blending is so that you don't look like something different from the background. You look like part of the background. And you become, relatively speaking, invisible. Another form of camouflage that's completely counterintuitive, and I'll show you an example of it later, is called disruptive contrast, which is the last thing you'd think of is a form of concealment, but it is. And the third variety of camouflage is countershading. And the poster fish for countershading is the great white shark, which is not white at all, as you can see. And look at the shark's coloration. Now, this is my very poor imitation of a shark, okay? Suppose you're above the shark looking down on it. You're looking into deeper, darker water. And against that background, the gray dorsal surface of the shark will tend to blend in. If you're underneath the shark looking up, you're looking toward shallower, brighter water, and the cream-colored ventral surface of the shark will tend to blend into that. So this is countershading. It's really rather common among animals, especially if they're more worried about like predators from above or from below. The shark, of course, isn't worried about predators. It's trying to get close to its prey. There are other forms of camouflage, of concealment, I should say. One is called masquerade. You are a tasty, succulent, defenseless little animal that anything and everything would like to eat. And so you may masquerade as something inedible, like a leaf or a rock or something like that. So a predator simply wouldn't perceive you as being something edible. And the final form of concealment is called mimicry. And this is kind of clever. Again, you're a relatively defenseless, tasty, nice, pleasant little animal, but you dress up to look much nastier than you are. You put on leather and studs and stuff like that. So you look like another animal that predators would avoid, whereas predators, if they knew what you were, would come after you, full tilt. And I'm going to show you examples of almost all of those. So here we get into the fun part. I'm going to show you pictures of concealed animals. And I'd like you to tell me what animal is concealed, and in some cases where it is. And again, if you've seen it before, hold your fire. So the first one's easy. And if you see what it is, just call it out. Remember, hearing aids. What's a giveaway? What made you know it was a fish? And also probably the shading on the head. This is a flounder, shallow water, flat fish, hugs the bottom. It's not hiding from its prey. It's hiding from its predators. Okay, the next one's a little bit more challenging. It is, in fact, a caterpillar. Now, caterpillars are like the tater tots of the animal world. I mean, like everything eats them. every bird species damn near will eat caterpillars because they're just pops of protein. They're defenseless with a few exceptions. And so this is masquerade. When the caterpillar isn't eating, when it's quiescent or when it senses a predator in the vicinity, it has done a wonderful job of looking like an inedible twig. And the giveaways here, by the way, those are legs, and down here are some more legs. And that may not have been what gave it away. The shape also, of course, is pretty reminiscent of a caterpillar. Okay, now we'll get a little more challenging. Okay, what's the giveaway? It's that triangular, the shadow typically at the front of the wings. But this is a fascinating example of evolution at work and adaptation that we have real records of occurring, and I'm going to go into that. This is the peppered moth. This moth is quite common in the UK and in parts of Europe. So let me make a little detour here. So here's a timeline going back 250-ish years. Back 1700 and before that, the major sources of energy powering human activity were wind, windmills, water, water wheels, fires, hearths and forges, and horsepower, ox power, human power. That's what powered things at that time. And we have records of this moth going back hundreds of years, including drawings and then later photographs of what this moth looked like. And hundreds of years ago, it looked like that. It looked, white with the black spots. 1750-ish, the steam engine gets invented as a reliable source of power and sort of portable. In England, mostly originally fueled by wood, but then quickly the British figured out that coal was a much more effective fuel, and England has a ton of coal, and so steam engines became coal-fired by the late 1700s, spread across the continent, and here we had steam engines powering all these human activities. Most, if not all of those steam engines powered by coal, and the result of coal-fired steam engines proliferating was everything turned black, right? Coal dust, soot, filled the air of the cities, covered the buildings, covered the streets, covered the trees, covered, the plants, covered the people. Everything was covered with a layer of black coal soot by, the early 1800s, 1850. Guess what happened to the moth? There were always a few mutants, mutations, natural mutations of coloration in the moth population. A few of them were dark colored rather than light colored, but as everything turned black, guess what? Those black mutants were better adapted than their light-colored brethren. And so they proliferated and the white moths almost disappeared. And that's a black moth against a black bit of tree bark. The white moth stands out like a neon sign, and the black moth is almost invisible. Well, beginning in the late 1800s and, of course, extending through today, pollution laws came into effect, technology improved, and over time, the air and water got cleaned up, and the black soot eventually went away, and things reverted to the way they looked pretty much, before that episode. And guess what happened to the moths? And when you look at the populations of the moths, pre-industrial revolution, almost all were white, very few were black. Then with the Industrial Revolution and black soot, the white population plummets, the black population explodes because it's better adapted. Then as the pollution is reduced and more or less eliminated, the situation reverses itself again. So we have solid records here, and these moths reproduce several times a year. So it's easy to see these kinds of population explosions in rapidly reproducing species. But it's a fascinating example of camouflage adapting to changes in the ecological niche where these moths are common. What is it? I don't know if that helps. There's this. This is a spider. And this is a picture of a wolf spider, roughly the same size and roughly in the same position as the spider that's concealed in the big picture. This is a leg. This is a leg. This is a leg. And I think there's a leg here. Here's the abdomen of the spider, the head. These are the palps. You can see the legs. The wolf spider is an ambush predator. Its prey are insects, both ants, which move pretty rapidly, but also flying insects that happen to be on the ground. So wolf spiders can't fly, and they can move pretty fast, but not as fast as some of their prey. And so they are ambush predators. What they want, here's the spider, what they want is for an ant to be walking along, not perceive that there's anything here, and get close enough so that typically in one leap, the spider's got the ant or whatever insect is nearby. So this is a very common reason for concealment is ambush predation of fast and agile, and in some cases flying prey. This is another caterpillar. This caterpillar's preferred food is mango leaves. These are mango leaves. And you notice the leaves have a very distinctive central vein. And the caterpillar has a stripe running the length of its back that looks exactly like the central vein of the leaf. The caterpillar has the same color as the leaf, and the legs of the caterpillar are fringed. I don't know if you can see that. And the fringe tissue is the same color as the leaf, and furthermore, each of the legs has a central line on it that look a lot like the secondary veins of the leaves. Now, most of the time, of course, what a caterpillar is doing is eating. But again, if there's any indication of a predator, namely bird, in the vicinity, the caterpillar will actually go to and locate itself along the central leaf of the leaf, central vein of the leaf, and it becomes almost invisible. What kind of snake is this? Coral snake. Anybody else? This is a king snake. And the reason why you thought it was a coral snake is because its strategy is mimicry, and it looks just like the venomous coral snake. King snakes are constrictors. They're not venomous. They're not particularly dangerous to a decent-sized bird predator, for example, but a coral snake is. Let's see if I can. Yeah. But let me show the two of them side by side. Same colors, red, yellow, black. Same circumferential banding of the colors on the body. And the only obvious difference, and a good one to keep in mind if you're out hiking, is that the coral snake, black is bounded by yellow, and the king snake, yellow is bounded by black. But this is mimicry where a non-poisonous, not terribly dangerous snake is mimicking much more dangerous species that predators will tend to avoid. So it did a good job of fooling you, didn't it? So here's the leopard. Now this is a bit of a cheat because this is zoomed out a little bit, so it's not taking up most of the picture. The leopard is an ambush predator because look at its prey. Its prey are primates and ungulates, antelope. So its prey are very fast, very agile. Most species of primates in Africa, which is where this particular species is native, are arboreal. Now, leopards can climb, but not as well as monkeys can. And so this leopard will not be able to outrun, chase down its prey. So it's an ambush predator. It wants to get within a leap or two of its prey and use the element of surprise and that, fraction of a second to get to them before they can accelerate away. You may have seen pictures on nature programs of leopards up in a tree above a little herd of antelope and, dropping down on them. I have read that only about 1 out of 10 leopard attacks is successful, but because the prey are pretty good sized, one antelope will feed the leopard for some days, including a female with cubs. So they don't, apparently 1 out of 10 is adequate if you're a leopard. Probably not for us. Okay, I heard. How many? These are very appropriately named leaf litter toads. Now, toads mostly are moving, but when they're quiescent, these toads do an interesting variety of things. They pull in their limbs, which makes their shape more reminiscent of the leaves on the forest floor. You notice there's a natural variation in their color, which matches the variation in the leaves. And you notice that they have a stripe down their spine, which looks like the central vein of a dead leaf. They eat ants. They're pretty fast, so they can get ants, and they have a nice long tongue. But look at their predators, snakes, raptors, and raccoons, 3 very different species, by the way, with very different visual capabilities, which we'll talk a little more about. Okay, you know what these are. This is disruptive contrast. Now, you'd say, why in the world would you try to camouflage yourself with bold black and white stripes? Well, for a very long time, for the last 100 years, the assumption has been that the advantage of this coloration is outline blurring. Look, these are herd animals. They eat as a herd. they sleep as a herd, and when they're not spooked, they move as a herd. And look at the herd. It's surprisingly difficult to pick out individual animals because these stripes just, make your eyes go crazy. And so the thought for a very long time was predators, lions, very common predator, looking at a herd, the predators want to pick out small, weak, injured, old, easy pickings. And here you can barely make out an individual animal, let alone target one that looks like it might be a little easier to go after. So for a very long time, that was the idea of why this coloration had evolved. By the way, this kind of coloration was actually used as camouflage on Navy ships in World War II to break up the outline of the ship against the horizon and the sky. So, a lot of very high-powered people thought it worked. But in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a radical reconsideration of why this camouflage evolved, what this is intended to do. And the main reason for reconsidering the story I just told you about lions not being able to make out individuals, this is what a lion would see. Lions have terrible color vision and terrible visual acuity. They can't see any detail from a distance, especially stalking distance. And lions often stalk at night when color doesn't matter anyway. So these animals could just as well be, they could all be bright red, and it wouldn't make any difference in terms of what the lions can see. They could be brown like horses, wouldn't make any difference to what the lions see. And so, and on top of it, the way that lions at least and hyenas hunt these things is to spook the herd, get them to run in panic so they're no longer a tight bunch. They begin to spread out, and guess who's lagging behind? The old, small, weak, sick, etc., and those become the targets. So the postulate in recent years has been, nuh-uh, this isn't about fooling lions. Okay, so why do I have millions and millions, 3 species of zebra, all of which have this very bold striping? Well, Africa particularly is full of blood-sucking insects that carry diseases, some of which are invariably fatal to equines. And this is what a tsetse fly would see. Terrible visual acuity. The fly's got to get really close to see any detail, and even then it's a blur. Okay, where's the skin? Where's the surface here? Is the white foreground or background versus the black? What am I looking at? Am I looking at edges and drop-offs? Where do I land to take a bite? And if that isn't very persuasive as an argument, experiments have been extremely persuasive. It sounds cruel, but it's not quite as cruel as it sounds. What scientists have done is they have taken a group of zebras, healthy, and a group of uniformly colored horses, related species, equines, healthy, put them into a controlled environment and released blood-sucking insects who have been raised in a lab so they're not carrying any diseases. And what they have found in repeated experiments is the zebras get bitten much less than the horses do. Variation. 2 groups of identical solid-colored horses, controlled environment, flies released. 1 group of horses covered with zebra skins draped over their back. Guess what? The horses covered with zebra skins get bitten much less than the uncovered horses. So the current thinking among, I would say, many, if not most scientists who study zebras is that the purpose of this coloration is not to fool lions, it's to fool tsetse flies and other blood-sucking insects. It's a different form of camouflage, I suppose. Now, I have found Waldo, but I'm not going to leave this up long enough for you to do it. You can see it at your leisure. What is it? No. Snake. It's a snake. It's a snake. It is a vine snake, and against these particular plants, it's masquerading very effectively. It really looks like a leaf of this plant, but against a green environment, just this coloration is wonderful camouflage. And you can see, and the giveaway here is right there, is the eyes. Here's an old friend coming up. You all know what this is, right? This is our native horned lizard. And although it's blotched to match very common, this is coarse grained granite. It's sitting on very common rock, both here and around the Southwest. And you notice its coloration and its blotching looks a great deal like that granitic background. It's got a flat-ish body to try to minimize the shadows around the edges. Very common, we see these pretty regularly. Okay, next one. What kind of butterfly is this? So I heard monarch. Do I hear any other bids? Yeah. This is a queen butterfly. And the reason that you thought it was a monarch is because it is mimicking the unpalatable monarch butterfly. Queens are palatable. They're tasty if you're a bird, apparently. Monarchs are not. You probably recall that the caterpillar stage of monarchs eats milkweed. Milkweed has several very distasteful compounds, some of which are stored in the body of the caterpillar and carried into the body of the adult butterfly. So I've been told by a number of birders that a young adult, immature, inexperienced bird will eat a couple of monarchs and then swear off of them. And experienced birds won't go after them at all. And what a good job here. Coloration is the same. The orange, the black, the white spots, the pattern is the same. Very effective mimicry of a palatable butterfly mimicking an unpalatable butterfly. And the idea here is not that you'll never get eaten, but if you're a queen, if a predator looks at a queen butterfly and just for an instant hesitates because it looks a lot like something it's eaten before that didn't taste good, that may be enough time for the queen to escape. So there's a reason for this. What kind of bird is it? It's a nighthawk. Nighthawk is a ground nesting bird. So there's a very good reason why this bird, when it's on the ground, because of the mottled pattern of its feathers, looks like, blends into the very common background of the places where it lives. Okay, the next one is a stumper. So what is it? What do you see? Say something. A rodent. No, it's not a rodent. I love the name of this animal. The satanic leaf-tailed gecko. And look at the species name, Fantasticus, which it clearly is. Okay, this is the head of the gecko bent sharply to your left. This is one of the forelimbs of the gecko, and you can see toes out there. And here is the body of the gecko widening into the tail. And here's what it actually looks like. So, fantastic job of masquerading. Yeah. That's what it really looks like. This one must be older because it's a little more mottled. But okay. Now, there's a number of odd things running through all the pictures I've shown you. And I'm going to give you a hint about the first odd thing that I want to point out. All of the examples I've shown you have a single mode of concealment. In other words, by the time they're an adult, their color and their pattern is fixed. Can't change. Now, there are a few animal species that can alter their coloration. Among marine animals, the cephalopods, octopi, squid, cuttlefish, are amazing. They can change color, pattern, even texture within seconds as they move from one environment on the seafloor to another. Extraordinarily facile at being able to change. On land, far fewer animals can do that. Chameleons, there's a reason they're called chameleons, right? They can change color and pattern to a degree. Some iguanas can change color, but very limited, like go from gray to blue, depending on whether they're pissed or not, stuff like that. All the animals I've shown you have a single mode of concealment. Now, what's weird about that? Think about their predators and prey that I showed you. Most of these animals have a number of different species that are predators and or prey, and many of those species have very different visual capabilities. See different colors, see different levels of detail. Some of them don't have good depth perception, etc., etc. So these animals that I've shown you that have a single mode of concealment, like the leaf litter toads, snakes, unless they're pit vipers, terrible vision. Raptors, superb vision from great distances. Raccoons, mammals, somewhere in between. Leopard prey, primates see as well as we do. Antelope, ungulates, remember, very limited color vision, terrible visual acuity. And yet, the same concealment works against all of these different visual capabilities among all these different predator and prey animals. Even though they see very differently. They're not seeing the same thing when they look at the concealed animal, and yet they're all reacting as if the animal's concealed. Here's an example. This is the leopard picture I showed you. On the left is the original picture, and that's what a primate would see, because they can see as well as we can. They see the same colors we do, they have the same visual acuity we do. They would see the picture on the left. That's what an ungulate would see. Can't see red at all, for example. Very limited color vision in general. Terrible visual acuity. So from whatever distance this picture was taken, it'd be a complete blur. So you'd say, well, that's really good for the leopard, going after antelope. 1 out of 10, somehow, and they can get primates, even though the primates can see extremely well. Here were those leaf litter toads. On the left is the picture I showed you. That's what a raptor would see. Their vision is better than ours. This is what a snake would see. Very limited color vision, very lousy visual acuity. So you'd say, well, wait a minute, pit vipers. These toads are amphibians. So they're cold-blooded, which means that if the toad is quiescent against the forest floor for any length of time, what happens to its body temperature? It matches the body temperature of the forest floor. So the toad is invisible even to pit vipers because of the fact they're cold-blooded. But look at the different visual capabilities among the different things that actually eat these toads. Now there's something else that's even weirder. Now be honest here. How many of you spotted the satanic leaf-tailed gecko before I pointed it out? Raise your hand. Okay, a couple of you. So that's 3 out of 30 or 40. How many of you were fooled for at least a few seconds by at least one of the things I showed you? Pretty much everybody. That's really weird. That's really weird. Because why in the world should these examples of animal concealment fool us? In most cases, the concealment strategy that you've seen on these animals evolved long before genus Homo existed, let alone humans being any significant part of their ecosystem. In general, with a few exceptions, we are not their predators or prey. Maybe you eat toads, I don't know, but most of these animals are not predators or prey. And we see the world differently than many of their predators and prey do. So this single mode of concealment not only fools their natural predators and prey with very different visual capabilities, the single mode of concealment also fools us with Very good color vision, very good visual acuity, very good depth perception, very good lots of stuff. Fools us too. What's going on here? Single mode of concealment. Animal can't change its color or its pattern. Very different visual capabilities of its predators and prey and even us. And yet we all get fooled. So we all see the world differently, but we're taking all the different input data that our visual receptors are sending into our nervous system, and we're interpreting that very different visual data the same way. Namely, the animal's hidden. We can't see it. So how is it that what we know are different inputs, different colors, different levels of detail, different all kinds of stuff, what's happening that's converting that into the same output, which is a behavioral output, namely, I'm just going to keep walking. Nothing to see there. So if I look at it kind of graphically, just these observations that you all just experienced tell us that somehow different data are being processed and interpreted and turned into behavior in the same way across an enormous variety of very different animal species. So, thinking of it graphically, visual receptors of one kind or another, different animals have very different visual receptors, tons of data going into their nervous systems, different colors, different detail, all kinds of differences. At the other end, the behavior, nothing there. All the same. So something's going on in the nervous systems of all these different animals and in us that is converting different inputs to the same behavioral output, namely nothing there. So what's going on? Well, over the last 75 years, some extraordinary work by hundreds and maybe thousands of scientists have actually discovered what's going on here. And what they have found is, okay, complex visual input coming in, different from animal to animal. What's going out seems to be something much simpler, namely, is there something there that I could eat? Yes or no. Is there something there that could eat me? Yes or no. As simple as that, and that is what's causing the animal, the prey animal or the predator to behave in a certain way. So something's happening that's simplifying all this complex visual data into something very simple in the way of output in the nervous system. And what scientists have discovered in hundreds of different species is what's going on is there are specialized structures in the visual processing portion of animal nervous systems across the animal kingdom that act like feature detectors. Here are some of them. So this mass of visual data comes in, and what happens in the visual portion of the nervous system is there are specialized structures that only look for edges in the mass of data that's come in. In other words, big differences in contrast between contiguous areas. And they only send a signal on to the rest of the nervous system if they see an edge or multiple edges. So it's a yes-no. There can be megabits of visual input. All this structure cares about is, are there edges? Yes, no. There are motion detectors, of course. Is what's coming in the way of input data changing relative to the space of my retinal cells, for example, over short periods of time? Yes or no. There are orientation detectors in many animals, which is it vertical or not relative to gravity, which fortunately, can be used everywhere as a reference. There are pattern detectors that seem to vary from animal to animal depending on their particular ecosystem and their predators and prey. There are animals that have spot detectors, like if there are leopards around. They're looking for areas, compact areas of particular color or contrast surrounded by larger areas of a different color or contrast. There are stripe detectors in some animals. And there are a variety of other detectors, but all of these detectors have the same characteristic, which is they take a massive visual input data and they just look for one thing and they say yes or no. And it's only the yes or no that gets passed on to the rest of the animal's nervous system, including whatever neurons control its actions, its musculature, and how it moves and acts. And let me give you some examples here. An ungulate, a grazer that eats grass. So it gets real close. Remember, lousy visual acuity, can see green quite well because that's what it eats. Can't see red because it doesn't eat red very much. So a ton of visual input goes into the visual portion of its nervous system where it goes through these detectors, and what comes out from those detectors is that. There's green stuff oriented vertically, a bunch of it growing out of the ground. And the animal has learned either genetically from a parent and or from its own experience that pattern is food. So, and here's the real point of this. Why? This is a multiple megapixel image. I mean, I took it from somewhere, and I know how many pixels it was. It was several megabytes. This is 5K. So what these detectors have done is they've taken a ton of input data, and by looking only for certain characteristics and answering only yes or no, they have reduced all that data down to something very, very simple. And that's what controls the behavior of the animal. Remember him? The wolf spider that few of you could see, at least not for a few seconds. Okay, same thing going on. Now, birds, great vision, are among the predators. So you're a bird looking at this, going through detector processing. And that's what you see. And birds that eat spiders a lot, scientists have actually found they have pattern detectors that are looking for radial edges that are the legs of the spider. And here, because of the camouflage, because of the concealment, that pattern is not picked up by the raptor's pattern detector. It sees a few isolated, not oriented edges, short, not connected in any way, and so it concludes, just as we did initially, that there's nothing there. So now what's extraordinary here is that this process is going on. Scientists have tested and found these detector structures in thousands of species. It's not hard to extrapolate that this might be common in millions of animal species that exist today in all kinds of different environments. Okay, why would that be? I mean, We've got millions of different animals. These are all, by the way, I'm only talking about the macroscopic animals. I'm not talking about the millions and millions of species of bacteria, for example, which are animals. These are macroscopic. How is it possible that these wildly different species, from insects to great whales, have the same set of processes? Well, it seems to be the case because concealment works. Now, one possible explanation for this that has been offered is parallel evolution. Think of euphorbia and cactus, right? Very different plants, look very much the same, function very much the same because they evolved old world, new world in the same kind of environment, namely an arid environment. Parallel evolution. Problem with that. Millions of species of animals living in every conceivable ecological niche on the globe. It's just not plausible that all of these species, even the thousands that have been studied from all over the world, could possibly have all evolved these same kinds of structures in parallel with each other. A much more parsimonious explanation that makes much more sense is that, and that we know to be the case, is that most animals on Earth today evolved from a common ancestor that lived many, many millions of years ago. And presumably, these processes developed in that common ancestor a very long time ago, and all of the descendants that have radiated out over millions of years from that common ancestor share those same processes because they work, and they work really well. And that begs a question. Early animals got more input data from their sense receptors than their very limited nervous systems could possibly process. And there's a contemporary example that's used as kind of the poster worm for this, for this statement. This is a roundworm called C. elegans. It is 1 millimeter long, that's a 25th of an inch. It's been studied for 50 years by hundreds of scientists, and we know everything about it. And this is viewed as being relatively similar to probably what that ancient common ancestor looked like, because it's really simple. This worm has exactly, I love this, 302 neurons. They've counted, 302. Now, in comparison, we have hundreds of billions of neurons, 302. Of the 302 in this worm, 60 to 80 of the neurons are specialized as sense receptors. There are neurons that can sense UV light, vision. There are neurons that can detect a couple of very specific chemicals in the environment, taste or smell. There are neurons that can detect pressure on the body of the worm, touch. And so these sensory receptors, 60 or 80 out of 300, reporting in real time, sending a lot of data in. There's 200 neurons left to process that data. Nuh-uh, not going to happen. What scientists have discovered, even in this extremely simple worm, is that another 50 of these neurons are what scientists have called interneurons, which means, guess what? They're feature detectors. They look at the input from multiple of the sensory neurons, and they compare them, and only if there is or isn't a match do they send a signal on to the few neurons that are left that control the musculature of the worm and tell the worm which way to move. So, for example, there are neurons, sensory neurons, that detect chemicals, 2 specific chemicals. And there's an interneuron that takes the output from these 2 sensory cells, compares the signals, and only if both of those cells detect their respective A and B chemicals will the detector send a signal on to the musculature controlling part of the worm, because those 2 chemicals together mean food. Either one of them alone is not food. If it's food, then the signal will tell the muscles of the worm which way to turn the animal to go toward the food. So even in this extraordinarily simple animal, we already find feature detectors. And the reason apparently is it's a way of dramatically simplifying the amount of data that the worm has to process with its extraordinarily limited nervous system in order to guide its behavior. Now, you know, this is enough for this worm to survive and reproduce. Even though more advanced animals obviously have more processing capability, we also tend to get much, much, much more sensory input. Think about us, for example, 100 billion nerve cells. Most of them, not doing much most of the time, but what the heck. Millions of retinal cells sending signals. We can detect changes. Motion pictures have got to, you need at least 30 frames a second for you to see continuous motion. So every 30th of a second, millions of retinal cells are sending signals into our nervous system. Thousands of olfactory cells, thousands of taste buds, hundreds of millions of sensors on our skin for heat, cold, pressure, all kinds of stuff. So we're getting gigabytes of data every second, and even our 100 billion neurons have got other things to do. And so it's pretty clear that what's not happening in our brains is we're not building 3D replicates of all the detail that we're seeing or smelling or hearing or touching outside. We are going through a series of, is it a person, yes or no? Is it food, yes or no? Is it a predator? Is it a leopard? Yes or no? Very simple, and that's controlling our behavior, even in our very well-developed nervous systems. Okay. Now, common ancestor. So again, I don't want to beg the question. Family portrait. This should be on everybody's wall. As of about 6 years ago, this is the oldest known animal that's ever been discovered, Icaria. It was discovered in Australia, and the fossils of this animal were found in sediment that allowed it to be dated to 555 million years ago. And that works well with the fossil record, because beginning about 500 million years ago was what was called the Cambrian explosion, where animal species just proliferated like crazy on Earth. And this would be 50 million years earlier, so it kind of works that this would be a common ancestor. And this is currently considered the earliest known animal, where the definition that scientists currently use for what's an animal, a macroscopic animal, is it's got a distinctive front and back, and the front and the back are connected by reasonably symmetrical sides, tissue in between, and each of the front and the back have a opening, and those openings are connected by what we would call a gut. Those are the characteristics that define a macroscopic animal, and the fossils of Icaria were sufficiently detailed for scientists to determine that it met those criteria. So right now, meet your great-great-great times 4 million grandfather, and size of a grain of rice. So actually, 5 or 10 times bigger than that worm, C. elegans, I just showed you. And the thought is that if C. elegans today is, at all representative of what the nervous system of this worm was like, then probably the same structures would have evolved, because this is a burrowing worm. It's eating biological organic material in the soil. It doesn't want to be at the surface. It doesn't want to, drown. So it's got to have sensory organs, and probably it had a very simple nervous system and required the input to be simplified in order for it to be able to process appropriately and respond appropriately to what it was perceiving in its environment. So the bottom line is, the fact that concealment works really tells us something profound about the world, far beyond the fun and games of, trying to identify the animals. It tells us that in spite of these wildly different animals with very different visual capabilities, something's going on so that all of us are interpreting the world, behaving the same way in spite of the vast differences in the visual input. And we think that's because, and scientists have found these same neural structures functioning the same way in thousands of species of animals. It's these feature detectors that are just looking for the answer to a simple question, and it's a yes or a no. And that's what's happening. And that's because we think those capabilities must have developed very early in our evolution. And because they worked really well, were maintained as animal species proliferated around the world. Okay. I have a bridge to no. I've been talking about concealment, which is a visual sense, because it's easy to understand, you can see it, it's fun, but I want you to think about a couple more things. Why do flowers and fruit smell nice to us? Their aromas did not evolve to attract us. Their aromas evolved to attract pollinators or animals that would eat their fruit and spread the seeds. We don't pollinate unless we're scientists doing experiments. And we do eat the fruit. Typically, we don't spread the seeds very widely, unless we're backpacking. But these flowers and fruit smell nice to us, and they did not evolve to smell nice to us. The songs of humpback whales and many bird species sound very pleasant to us. And those songs did not evolve for our benefit. These songs evolved to communicate to other members of the same species, to establish territories, to attract mates. They had nothing to do with us, and yet we can buy recordings of the songs of humpback whales and many bird songs because they sound very pleasant to us. And what this is telling us is, again, in spite of the fact that there are millions of species of macroscopic animals that look and behave wildly different, living in every possible ecological niche on Earth, there are some very fundamental commonalities between all of those species in how we interpret the world, even if we perceive the world very, very differently. And that's, to me, an extraordinary finding that you can illustrate just by looking at pictures of concealed animals. Thank you.